Well, friends, welcome back to our CGCC discussions. The first part we talked about God's purposes for finances. Well, today we're going to be talking about using our finances for His glory. But once again, we've got Scott and Denise. All right, let's go. There's this idea of true treasure. How does our view of finances and where our treasures lie, how does that connect? What does that actually mean?
Matthew 6 and also Luke 12, which is the same story. It ends with seek ye first the kingdom of God and all these things will be added to you. But the verses leading up to that are all about not worrying about what you will wear, what you'll have, and all those sort of things, what you'll drink, and reassuring us that God knows about all these things, and that if we seek first His kingdom, then He's faithful to give us all these things. And it's something, probably the first verse I can really remember God really implanting in my heart, and I was probably about 15 or 16, where that really, someone spoke on that at church, and it really impacted me, and it's something it's really stuck with me throughout the last 30 years since, 35 years since. And it's always something that's been a great comfort to me in the times where I've had need, and also a challenge in the times that where I've been financially secure. That even where I, in a sense, have money to provide for my own needs, it's actually God that's providing for my needs, and that's the flip side of God providing what we need, is actually making sure that we don't usurp God's role just because we think we can in those times.
I've got a quote here that I'd like to read. It says, God doesn't care how much you have, but how you use it. What we do with our money, how we steward God's money, nudges our life towards Him or away from Him. Every financial transaction reveals our heart by presenting an opportunity to worship Jesus and serve His kingdom, or worship ourselves and serve our own lesser kingdom. God is good, and He makes good things in heaven and on earth. When Jesus discourages us from storing up earthly treasures, He's not saying that money and possessions are bad, they simply won't last.
Who's the quote from?
I don't know, it's a book that you gave one of my kids to read at one stage. Can't remember. But it just keeps that perspective, I think, of we're on earth for a purpose. It's not to serve ourselves. And all of it's going to be lost in the end, so...
There's this whole language in the Christian world called tithing. And if you're wondering, no, this is not me doing a bit of a plug for church building fund or any kind of thing. What's your perspective on tithing? What is tithing? So for those of us who might not know what tithing is, and then, what's changed for you over the years, and any scriptures come to mind?
Well, tithing at the base level is giving a percentage of your income to God. In the Old Testament, it's laid out in great detail, specifically for the Israelites, 10% of all sorts of different things. But it's a biblical principle beyond the Old Testament about giving back to God. Now, whether you say strictly 10% or not, but the point is you give back to God out of what He gives to you. And in fact, if you look at Malachi 3, it talks about the children of Israel robbing God by not giving Him their tithe. But then he goes on to say, challenges them to put Him to the test. He says in Malachi 3:10, it says, "Thereby put me to the test, says the Lord of hosts, if I will not open the windows of heaven for you and pour down for you a blessing until there's no more need." And that really speaks to God's nature. Again, it could sound quite transactional. You give your tithe, God gives you a blessing, but it's far more than that. I think the other verse that impacted me around tithing was this idea of we've touched on it already a bit, about our attitude to giving. In Luke 6 it talks about given it will be given to you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, it will be poured into your lap. So again, this idea of generous receiving, but it goes on to say, for the measure you use for others is the one that God will use for you. So we should be we should be trying to emulate God. We should be giving generously and cheerfully and pressed down, bubbling over. And so the tithing, in a sense, is a bare minimum. It's about, again, what we talked about before, the heart with which we have and the place that we put finances.
Posture, isn't it?
It is the posture.
And there's a good illustration in the Bible with the Macedonian church that you pointed out too in your notes, who they were desperately needy themselves, and yet they were giving out in abundance, to help others.
Yeah.
So I think, I guess when people say I can't afford a tithe, I think it comes down really to a heart attitude. Because my challenge would be, how much do you spend on yourself each week, and what are the needs and what are the wants, and categorise them then. And then you might be able to see that actually I do spend a lot on myself that could actually go back to God, you know. So when we were in Africa, so I said before that we dealt with desperately poor people. And we had an older lady who came to the Lord, and she never knew where her next meal was coming from. She never had any coins in her pocket. But she understood the concept of tithing, but she couldn't give it in monetary terms. So her tithe to the church was that she would walk many kilometres each Saturday, and she would sweep what we call a donkey, just a shade shelter. So she would sweep the ground. She would fill up the cannery pots with clean water for the next day, and that was her tithe. And she did that week after week after week. And I applauded her because I thought, you know, she was an illiterate lady, new to faith, and yet she understood the concept of tithing straight away. And I just sort of thought, even if we don't have the monetary means, you know, there's other ways in which we can tithe. And, you know, I think the whole aspect of church life and discipleship is being involved in your working bees, in your prayer meetings, in church life. That's also, I think, part of our discipleship, which actually ties in with tithing as well.
So it's not just necessarily finances, right?
So... but yeah, so that was just a situation where I applauded this lady, but I think,
I think in our church we don't talk a lot about tithing or money. Other churches I've been part of in the past just talk about nothing else. It seems, you know, there's a lot of pressure to give, and that, I think that's wrong as well. In fact, when I was preparing for this, I can only think of 2 people that have ever spoken to me about tithing, other than perhaps my own kids. But one was a couple that were living by faith, as they described it, and I can't remember what he did for a job, but their thing was, we don't have any money, so we can't afford to tithe. I thought, well, that was actually completely backwards, because if you're living by faith, the first act of faith would be to give, even when you think you can't afford it. Another one was some close friends of ours back in the day who had, again, 3 young children. His wife didn't work, she was looking after the kids. He was an apprentice chef, so he had virtually nothing. And they hadn't been tithing for thinking they couldn't afford it, but God really challenged them about tithing. So, you know, when they couldn't afford it, so to speak, they started tithing, and just his testimony of how God provided. You know, they come home and there'd be someone left a bag of groceries on their doorstep or money in the letterbox. You know, that simple act of faith or obedience, as we talked about before, that the obedience, God honours that obedience and provides for you. And again, you know, so much more blessing just through the simple act of obedience than trying to muddle on and balance it all up yourself.
Rob and I have always made a practice. We always gave to the church or missionaries first and lived off what we did afterwards. Now, I can't remember when we ever spoke about that when we were first married. But it was just a natural thing that we've always done. But I think I get concerned sometimes when I feel people short sheet God. You know, I can't afford it this week, so we'll just leave it, you know. But then that soon becomes a habit and soon there's nothing that's happening. And I think we're short-sheeting God. You know, He's given us everything. We need to, you know, honour Him with our wealth, no matter how small or how big. I think it's a good practice to, you know, start and always give first and live off the rest. But that's just the way we've always done it.
For me, one of the most challenging Bible verses on this whole area is in Acts 4. When it talks about in the early days of the church how people were selling land and everything they had and just bringing it to the apostles' feet, and nobody was in need because they shared. No one considered anything they owned to be their own. Everything was shared in common, and you know, I fell well short of that, I know, but it's just been a constant thing to just remember that what we have isn't really ours. You know?
And tithing can also be that spontaneous thing. You know, we don't just have to give the 10% or what we've chosen in our heart to give. We don't just have to give that extra to the missionary. If there's a special offering at church, you know, again, be that risk taker and do something, because there's so much reward in it. You know, there's just so much blessing when you can actually say, all right, Lord, you know, this is... And I think too, comes down to this sacrifices. In the Old Testament, they used to sacrifice. But if nothing's ever a sacrifice to us, what's the point? You know, and Jim Elliot, who was martyred in South America, he once said, he is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain that which he cannot lose. And I think that's a really good statement, you know, so
It is, yeah.
that we, you know, we've got this opportunity on earth, so let's be generous, cheerful, generous and regular givers and spontaneous givers, you know, and let's see what God can do.
Yeah, they're having that mindset, and you touched on it before about when you're talking about you felt like you were 40 years old and hadn't got what the world said you should get, you know, trying to remember that we're on earth for, you know, 80, 100 years or whatever, and we're in eternity.
Yes.
And Jesus saying, you know, do not build up treasures on earth, build up treasures in heaven where the thief can't steal and the moth can't destroy. And it's just constantly having that, and it's not just in finances, it's in everything, trying to have that long-term eternal focus. Because the world, I mean, it's the TV or anything, you know, just constantly giving adverts about retirement savings or investments and all this whole thing about providing for yourself in retirement, providing for yourself, providing for your family. And it's this whole message of you have to be self-sufficient. And
In this book that you gave one of my kids, another quote said, someone wrote that the single biggest competitor to authentic Christianity today is materialism, because it's robbing the hearts and souls of millions in our world today. And I believe that's true.
Yeah.
You know, that
Yeah.
even in the church, we think that we're immune,
Yeah.
but I think it does rob the
Does,
church of that full, you know, authenticity with God, you know.
The book's called Money, God or Gift.
Yeah.
And I think that's the posture that we're talking about, where how do we see, and tithing reflects that. If it's a gift, and you know, it reminds me of you talking about sacrificial giving. On one hand, you've got giving, sacrifice, but then there's also like, well, look at me. You know, the story of the widow and the Pharisees who were giving. Jesus says, you know, well, that poor woman there gave more because her posture and heart was everything that I had versus just giving for the sake of giving out of duty.
yeah, or giving, that's right, because I know people who are, I'd say, probably more generous than I am, but they do it because they like people knowing they're giving, you know, and that's just as wrong as being giving generously and doing it begrudgingly. I mean, it is that posture. I'd like to plug a book as well too. It was actually written by Lauren Cunningham. So he founded Youth with a Mission, YWAM. And it's called Daring to Live on the Edge, The Adventure of Faith and Finances. And it's just really changed my whole attitude towards money. I read it probably when I was in my early 30s. And it's largely the story of the founding of YWAM. But it's also just an incredibly inspirational story about sacrificial giving. You know, he literally sold his house when God told him to, and how God gave it back to him at the end of his life to retire. And but just an inspiring way of how God honours the obedience and the sacrificial obedience of people to give, and how he just came through time and time again, and just how much that they learnt and grew as Christians as well through having that total dependence on God to provide for them. As we talked about, I think in the first session, you know, that joy that comes from seeing God work in your life, and just that joy and sense of gratitude of seeing God provide actually spurs you on in all other different areas of your faith as well.
Well, guys, just the other thing was we had the question about God's economy. So there's different types of economy. There's the world view and the world's perspective, what economy is about, and God's economy. What do you have any thoughts and views on that?
Well, when I think about God's economy, I always think of that verse in Psalm 50 where it talks about God owns the cattle on 1,000 hills.
That's good.
So again, it reinforces that everything belongs to God, and He requires more than external compliance to commands. He desires internal righteousness. He doesn't need our sacrifices because He is a creator and sustainer of everything. God rebukes worship based on obligation. He wants true thanksgiving in the way we worship and give back to Him. God defies the notion that what people give to Him is theirs, and they are being big-hearted in parting with their property for God's sake. Why say that? If everything is God's, should we not be more ashamed of the little we give back, you know? I think he provides in his economy, he provides work so that we can help those who are in need. Our talents, our gifts, our income, our work, they're all been given by God. And we need to steward all of those things to the glory of him. I believe God wants us to take risks, and again, showing that we're not depending on money for security. And God wants us to cast our bread on the waters, to be risk takers, not reckless, like I said before, but to see how God can work when we trust him with all of our resources. So,
That's great, Denise. Yeah. That's a wonderful way of looking at God's economy and not it's a holistic picture. It's not just about the money.
I heard someone say years ago that God's economy is about giving and receiving. The world's system is about buying and selling. And it really has proved to be true, and we've talked about a number of stories already in these 2 sessions which have illustrated that. I even did a word search before we did this, and discovered that in the Bible, buying and selling is mentioned about 100 times, but giving or receiving is mentioned over 1,700 times. So God is all about giving and receiving.
And it's being faithful in the little to be faithful in the big.
That's true. Yeah, God is a multiplier.
Yeah.
He takes that seed and multiplies it many times, and often it's just a seed of faith or a seed of obedience, a seed of sacrifice, and he uses that.
Yeah, that's great. So it's reframing our thinking and mind when we think about seeing just in general everything that we have is through God's economy. So there might be some people listening in, and there are different seasons of life. And I guess what would you give a younger Denise or a younger Scott advice in this relation to it, or maybe in that season of young family, or maybe retiring, which I'm sure you guys are far away from, but yeah.
I won't share the stories, but both of my parents, who don't live together, they live in separate countries, they have both recently in the last few months moved into separate retirement living, and just the way that God has organised that whole thing has just been absolutely incredible. And it's just a reminder again that he remembers the little things, and he's got the details of our lives on his heart, and he's faithful. I'd share some some thoughts perhaps about people with young families, because many of the stories I've shared, and probably the season of my life where I learnt most about money and God's provision, was when I had young preschool kids and didn't have much money and all the rest of it, and then life is hectic. And I guess a challenge would be to, when you're in a time of need, don't always, and Denise has already alluded to this about being part of the solution. Just because you're in need, don't think God isn't going to ask you to give still. And it might not be money. I'm not saying give your last dollar to the church, but you might have something that you can still share with someone else. And again, through the act of obedience, the act of faith, that was going to release God's provision for you in another area of your life. Another thing I'd say, when you've got young kids, share your financial needs with your kids, and I don't mean go through the whole your budget with them, and also, sorry, can't afford pocket money as well. But just talk about the thing and pray together. I'll give you a simple but a profound example that happened to our family. We had a dining room table, and it was enough for 8 people. But when you had more than 8 people, it's just such a pain. So we said, look, kids, we're going to sit down and pray for another dining table that we can pull out when we have lots of visitors and put them together and have it. And we were sitting there praying we were at the table praying for the second table, and there was a knock on the ranch slider just beside the dining room, and there's our next door neighbour standing there with a dining room table. Oh wow! And he opened the door and said, "Oh, I've got this table I don't need. I wondered if you guys would need one." It was literally as we were praying. I mean, he would have left. You talked about God answering beforehand. He would have left his house. He's a couple of doors along before we started praying properly. But that happened. Exactly, happened right in front of our kids. They were primary age at the time. It was just a simple thing, but something you can just celebrate together. God providing something you asked Him for.
Heavenly Father cares.
Yeah.
I still think, even as a young family, even like we understand the hardships that young families are going through when they've got a mortgage and all sorts of other things, but don't short sheet God. Do your giving first, and live within your means and see how God will provide, So, but
So coming back in different seasons of life, maybe a thought I had was, We've talked about a young person or young family.
Young person first.
Okay, you go young person.
I keep on reiterating that we can't be responsible for big things if we've never learnt to be responsible for the little things. So I encourage young people, learn to give, you know, and it doesn't necessarily mean learn to give when you start your first job. Just see opportunities, even as children or whatever, how you can give. I still remember one time in Africa, and Michaela, there was a beggar who came to the door, and Michaela went inside and she grabbed every bit of francs that she had and she rushed it out and she gave it to that lady. And I just sort of thought that was beautiful, you know. But again, and I think learn to give cheerfully, sacrificially, and on a regular basis. Consider missionaries that you could support and start. This is good when you can start young, I think, or as a young person. And stop the impulsive buying. So maybe you need to look at...
Stop looking at Aldi catalogues, for example.
Yeah, or maybe, again, like I often quit. My kids will always say to me, you are the most unsentimental person where it comes to things, Mum.
Yeah.
And I like things,
Sure.
but I don't need them unless they're practical.
Yeah, okay.
But I always say, do I need this or do I just want it? And that will determine whether I buy it or not, you know. And I think that's a good gauge. And I try to say that to my kids, who can sometimes be big spenders, and I'll try to say, is that a need or is it a want? Because there's a big difference between the two. But yeah, I just sort of think, learn to stretch yourself as young people, you know. And I think there's no seasons of life where we can't do that.
Yeah. Retirees?
Yes.
Do you have any comments, Scott?
No, I touched on my parents briefly, but no, look, at the end of the day, depending on whether you're on, you know, if you're just on the pension, it's not a lot of money to live on. But again, it's having your order in your life right. You know, the Bible talks a lot about foundations in your life and having things in the right order, and finances play part of that. You know, if you have your attitude to money, or you worry about money, or you worry about whether God's going to provide for you, that by definition, if that's out of order, something else in your life is going to be out of order as well, because everything has to be in its place. And you know, every day is a test of your faith. But ultimately, if you're retired and you've got lots of money, well, then the challenge is different. And Leslie and I in this situation now where we've got more disposable income than we ever have. And so the challenge is, how do we give more, and who do we give it to, and how do we bless people with it? And you know, we haven't always been in that situation, but you know, it is seasons of life, and you know, kids are largely self-sufficient now, so that's a different challenge when you get to that stage in your life.
Denise, what are your thoughts?
I think that God grants retirement not to raise your standard of living, but to raise your standard of giving.
Nice.
So I guess whatever you're saving for, continue to be rich towards God and store up treasure for heaven, not treasure for yourselves. And I think that retirees have an incredible opportunity to do so much for God's kingdom, because they're free, they often have that money, you know, they can travel, but often the travel is for self-indulgence. And I think there is so much mission work that retirees could offer. You know, they could be the grandparents, you know, they've got life skills they can offer, they've got encouragement. You know, there's just so much they could offer by still seeing the world, but with a purpose. And I just sort of think, you know, it just saddens me when I just see people all the time, it's just one holiday after the other, and I think, do this for God's kingdom, do something. And I remember we used to have these teams from the States who used to come out called Friends in Action, and they used to drill deep bore wells for third world countries or housing or whatever. And these were all people in their 70s, 75s, and they funded it all themselves. They came out, they were incredibly generous to us. They were hard workers, they blessed us. You know, but this was their life. They just sort of said, you know, this is what we can give back to God because we've got the ability to do it now, you know. And I just sort of think they were the grandparents for my kids, you know. Yeah. They came out and they treated our kids with, you know, lollies that we wouldn't have had for 2 years or something, you know. And I just sort of think they can be such a blessing. And
they also have time. I mean, having said it, every retired person I know seems to be flat out and busy all the time, but we talked before about giving in ways other than financially, and that's something that retired people potentially, if their health is good, are able to do.
Even if it's not overseas, I've got so much they can offer locally too, you know. So I think if I get to a retirement age and I'm sitting in my chair and doing nothing, I need a good kick up my pants. So I'll give you permission to do that, you know.
We'll play this video for you. Statement. So,
But yeah, I just sort of think no matter what season in life, there's always something we can contribute.
yeah, that's exactly right. I think that's it, right? It's that perspective. You want to finish the race well, whatever season you're in, that God has set before you.
Yeah.
And part of that is every aspect of your life, not just retire all of a sudden.
And one day this world is going to fade away, and I want to go to heaven and have God say, "Well done, good and faithful." You know, so in every aspect.
Friends, thanks for joining us for part 2 and considering the idea of using our God's finances for His glory. I hope you've been hearing this common thing both in the first one and the second session, is that God is the one who sets the agenda for us when it comes to money, because it's His. And the reason for that, once again, is coming back to the gospel, the good news of Jesus, where God has been so graciously and wonderfully and generous with us as He's given us His Son sacrificially. And as followers of His, now we have resources given to us, not for our own use, but for His glory. So, hope that's helped you. And if you've got any other questions, drop an email to going through our website, and we'd love to connect with you. Thanks. Have you had any moments where with finances and giving or in general where God said no? Because that feels like sometimes it might feel like God's meant to say yes with everything.
That you want to give to someone, but then you feel...
Or a situation maybe you've just misheard. You've asked for something, whether if it's some sort of relief financially, and hasn't come the way that you thought, or...
I can think with our own family, how we have 3 children in their 20s.
Yeah.
And who are quite adept at taking loans from the bank of mum and dad.
Okay.
And I can think one particular example where I would be quite happy to forgive a debt to one of my kids, but I really felt that it would not have taught them.
Yep.
Now, they got in debt through their own lack of wisdom, and I had to bail them out. I really felt that if I'd forgiven that debt, they wouldn't have learnt the lesson of the thing that got them into that circumstance in the first place. So.
Yeah.
I've got another side to that, but it's not a positive ending, because in Africa, again, we would have people come to our door every day for need. And you used to get so jack of it. So sometimes you'd throw the money at them, but your attitude was really, really bad.
Yeah, okay.
Or there were times where you just said no, again, because your attitude was bad. It wasn't, that you couldn't help them. It was just because, I don't want to help you today. So that was more of selfish, again, a heart attitude. So...
Okay.